welcome to cooking class. I'm really glad that you guys could join us, and a couple participants are going to be joining us later. So I just want to let you know, if you have questions about this, you can email me, and the email is at the top. Those of you that got physical handouts, my email's at the top of it. It's rootednutrition@gmail.com. So I know this is out there now. I'm going to get lots of sauerkraut questions and pictures. Is this kraut okay? So for the next hour, we're going to be making sauerkraut. We can be making it together. So I'll introduce quickly who I am, and then also what you're going to need today, what types of ingredients that you need to have on hand, optional ingredients, because you can make this taste like lots of different ways. You can make it taste just like the stuff you put on your hot dog at the ballpark, or you can make it taste like just a vibrant, purple pickled cabbage salad or something like that. So we'll go through all those things. And also, as much as you guys are interested, I like talking about the health benefits of this food, because not only is it helpful for gardeners, because food preservation time, I'm curious about what you guys are growing too. Is there at least one person here who's growing some stuff that you think you could put into sauerkraut?
No, not this year, but definitely.
Not this year?
Next year, definitely.
Do you have any kale in your garden?
I do. Lots of kale.
Yeah, you can put kale in your sauerkraut. I know that's something that in the Pacific Northwest we grow a lot of.
Nice. Yeah. They don't steal it from the community gardens, the kale, for some reason.
Yeah, people always grow more than they can reasonably eat, or than they know how to cook with yet, because it's like a confidence building plant. Whereas cabbages, I know, are prone to pests a little bit, and I haven't braved it myself to plant cabbages in my small garden because they take up so much space. But that said, cabbage is the kraut in sauerkraut. So the most important thing is cabbage, and things in the cruciferous family, like kale, can also work. So I think someone else has joined. I will get started. My name is Andrea Potter, for those of you that are just meeting me. And my background is as I'm a chef, and I'm also a holistic nutritionist. And so basically, the recipes I make are for tasting good, and they're for practical kitchen applications. They're for food preservation, for all of that stuff. I'm also really interested in sustainable food systems. And so food preservation fits just like perfectly right in there. And then the other side of this is that this food is incredibly healing of the gut and helpful for the immune system. So we're going to talk about those things too. The basics of what you need today: you need a knife and a cutting board. You need, we're going to make a small batch in a 1 liter jar, and this is going to be like our crock. So I'll discuss what a crock is. If you're living in an apartment, you don't have a huge space, it wouldn't make sense to make a much bigger batch. You can make these throughout the season and just do small batches. The other thing that you need is a smaller glass, which fits inside your jar. And you'll see the reason for this later, but this is the low-tech system that I find is the most effective way to keep your sauerkraut submerged. So we'll hit that up later. I just want to show you alternatives. If you decide to go a little bit bigger, this is a crock. I think it's the only new crock that I ever bought. And this one, 1 means 1 gallon. So this is 4 quarts, I guess. And it does have some weights in it. So if you can find a crock with weights in it, that's great. You can buy weights of different sizes. And this is only for folks who are a little more serious about it. If you think you're going to spend more than $60 on sauerkraut in the next year, then it's probably worth getting one. Yeah, but so I would make this, say 2 or 3, if I had 2 or 3 cabbages harvested, then I would probably make about this much. But today we'll do a small amount with 1 cabbage. The other equipment that you need, optional, you can use a mashing utensil. And so I have a potato masher, and then this one is actually a pastry tamper. And I'm going to show you an alternative way to do it, where you could use a food processor, and you could also put that sliced cabbage in a freezer bag. So there's a little kind of like a mobility kind of hack that my friend taught me. So I was teaching this to somebody who had severe arthritis, and you know, there's a lot of chopping and there's a lot of physical mashing involved in this, and they came up with a really genius hack. So I will tell you about that as we get going. Okay, so let's do a little bit of resources too. How I got into sauerkraut. I actually ended up having a sauerkraut company. I live in Vancouver, and I noticed that it was hard to come across unpasteurized, real organic sauerkraut in the stores, and I realized how easy it was to make. And so I kept having requests from people who attended my workshops and cooking classes to make a product, and I did. I no longer sell that product. I'm not here to sell it. It turns out I love teaching cooking classes way more than I love running a food company. So it's interesting though, because I've done this in batches as small as today, 1 liter, and I've also done it in batches that are 700 liters, or sorry, 700 pounds. So that's, oh my gosh, I think 1,400 liters. My math could be wrong on that. It's huge. And all of it is the same. The ratio of salt to cabbage stays the same, and the same process goes for the whole thing. I didn't even have much more mechanical means when I was making big ones. I did a lot. I had a food processor, but I did a lot by hand. Right, how I got into sauerkraut. So I didn't grow up eating this food. It wasn't a familiar taste for me. So some of you may be new to this food, and some of you may be, it's just old hat for you, or you're used to having a bit of sauerkraut on a, you know, smoked meat sandwich, or you know, with bratwurst, or as a soup garnish or something. If you're new to this flavor, I really urge you to give it a try, and you can learn to love it in different ways too. If you don't love it on bratwurst or something, adding a little bit to a salad is really nice, as kind of like an extra zing, like where you would add pickles and things. Adding it on top of like roasted squash soup in the fall is just a beautiful little hit of flavor. So there's non-traditional ways to enjoy it as well. And how I came around to it was that it actually helped me heal my gut. And it's something that became this like incredibly simple but transformational food in my diet. And it hasn't left my fridge ever since. So it's been about, I don't know, 10 or 15 years that I've been loving sauerkraut for all the digestive benefits. So I just want to take a little bit of time to note a couple of those benefits. So sauerkraut is really interesting because the thing that makes the sauerkraut is the sour flavor, right? And the sour flavor doesn't come from vinegar. So you'll notice in our ingredients, you've got cabbage and you've got salt, and those are the bare minimum, but only essential required ingredients. If you want to add other stuff, then other vegetables can be added, but salt and cabbage are, that's it. That's it. You don't need and shouldn't have vinegar. And so the reason for that is that the magic of fermentation is what's responsible for the sour flavor, and that we're not just kind of marinating cabbage. So we're going to do it the real deal, and it's a longer, slower process. And so this kind of acid that's resulting from fermentation is, it balances the alkaline acidity of the body. It actually helps with digestion, whether your digestion is like over acidic or under acidic, or if it fluctuates rapidly, or you have heartburn type issues, it actually can help in those cases. It tonifies the intestines for healthy elimination, and that's true of cabbage itself, and especially true if it's turned into sauerkraut. It's high in probiotic bacteria. Some people are like, well, how high? I need my numbers. They're so high. It's very difficult to count, actually. I sent a sample of my kimchi, which is similar to sauerkraut, to my friend at a lab at UBC, and she kept having to water it down, and water it down, and water it down to even get a count on these probiotics. And so basically within 2 tablespoons, you're getting a few billion, about 10 to 20 billion of probiotics every day. And the probiotics are really like a broad spectrum, and so they help the gut to rebalance and maintain health from all sorts of different states. It's amazing. It's especially helpful in aiding the digestion of fats, and you'll notice that whenever sauerkraut is served, something fatty is served along with it. So there's all kinds of reasons for that. And one of them is that the acids in the sauerkraut help to emulsify, they kick your liver into gear to make bile and then emulsify fat. So brilliant. And I also put that it strengthens the nerves, and this is because the health of your gut is the health of your entire system. The health of your gut is actually 60 to 80% the health of your immune system. And so the roundabout way that I came to sauerkraut was when I went to my doctor and wasn't getting answers. I finally went to a naturopath, and she was talking to me about the health of my gut. But the reason I was there was that I kept getting sick. I said, I'm getting colds over and over and over, and I appear to be otherwise healthy, but like, what's going on with my immune system? And she kept talking to me about my gut, and I was like, lady, there's nothing wrong with my gut. I'm here talking about getting colds. So she very patiently explained to me about how my gut is my immune system, and I cannot have health of my immune system without my gut healing first. So I was on probiotics. I was on like very high level probiotics, and I found them to be incredibly helpful. And I was on digestive enzymes as well, which sauerkraut also has. And after a time of benefiting from those and getting my health back because of them, then I started to learn about where where probiotics and enzymes exist in food. Because I'm a cook, I started to get kind of naturally curious and go, I wonder where I can get that. Also because my supplements were becoming very expensive. So here we are. We're at cabbage and salt. I went the long way around, I think. Gardeners just go the short way. They're like, I grew cabbage. Now I have lots of cabbage. What do I do with it? Right. Let's do this. A couple of fun resources. Everything's backwards when I show it on Zoom. Wild Fermentation by Sandor Katz is, if you have one book on fermentation, this is the one that you should get. And it's got really simple drawings, like illustration pictures. Let's see if I can find one for you here. Here, this is a very simple setup showing what your sauerkraut could look like. The little jug and a crock. That's neat. So the author is Sandor Katz, K-A-T-Z, and he's a wonderful fermentation teacher and totally inspired me to do what I do. Another great book is called Nourishing Traditions by Sally Fallon. And this is more for like health, nutrition perspectives. It has a couple of good chapters, one on fermenting drinks and one on fermenting vegetables in the end here. And she also does soaking grains and making sourdough and those kinds of traditional skills. So with those two books, I was basically off to the races and figured out how to do it. But I prefer to learn from another human being. And so taking a workshop is great too. Right, I'm gonna get started. So let's talk just a tiny bit about the magic of fermentation. I don't have a purple cabbage here. I wish I did. You know, when you have like a plum or some grapes or a purple cabbage, you can see a little bit of kind of white film on it, right? You can even see it on apples, and sometimes we'll kind of shine an apple, right? I learned that kind of film is actually bloom. It's kind of like a yeast bloom, and it's evidence. I'm actually looking at a tiny bit. It's really difficult to see on camera, but I can see a little tiny bit of it along the stem here. And so this yeast bloom is evidence that there are yeasts, and yeasts never live just by themselves in nature. They live in community with bacteria. So there's yeast and bacteria already on the outside leaf of this cabbage. Yeah. So I can save an outside leaf for later if they're looking pretty good. And I'll show you, it's just another method that you can use to cover the top of your sauerkraut. And the reason that cabbage ferments so readily compared to all the other vegetables as well, not to deter you from the other vegetables, but see the shape here? Brilliant. So cabbage grows from the inside out, right? And it forms layers which trap the microbes from the soil. So we start with healthy soil, healthy organic soil, and it's teeming with microbes. So that's where all probiotics come from. This is having a hard time focusing on me. There I am. And the cool thing about cabbage is it's living near the ground and that it traps all of those microbes. And so even if I wash my cabbage, I recommend just, you know, wash with regular tap water just to get any big pieces of dirt off. This still has all the good stuff that you need to get fermentation started. And so I'm going to start by chopping, and then I'll talk to you about that hack that my friend showed me. So there are a few different, there's a traditional tool that you could use as well called a sauerkraut cutter, of course. I have one, but I didn't get it out of storage for this class. It's about this big, pretty big. It's meant for 2 people. And what I was going to show you was my Japanese mandolin. A mandolin is very similar. It's just a plastic piece of board like that with a blade in it. If you want to run the cabbage over that, that's another way to do it. If you want to just flex your knife skills, you could do it this way. And I'm just chopping something about as thick as you would for coleslaw and chucking it into a bowl or into a bucket. The bowl or bucket, the material of it doesn't matter. Metal is fine. We're not actually going to be fermenting in that bowl. So I'll keep chopping. And I'll tell you about this neat other method. So my friend / client who has severe arthritis came up with something really brilliant. And he said, why not use osmosis, first of all, to get that water out? And we're doing that partially here, but the help of the freezer is another thing that can really make the mashing part easier. So what we would do is make the chopping part easier by doing we would only do about 2 slices to make a big piece of cabbage like this. And then we put it through the food processor. I'm just gonna grab mine to show you which one I use. If you're not already using a food processor, I have this, I think this is an 8-cup, or no, this is a 10-cup food processor. And it comes with a slicing wheel, and then you can adjust the thickness. So find the thickness you like, and you can just run big pieces of cabbage all the way through your food processor. And anything like coleslaw or like stir fry can be done really simply there. The food processor method is great because the blades actually slightly bruise the cabbage. So it's not as good for salad in that way as a sharp knife, but it's even better for sauerkraut because our aim is to get the liquid out of the cabbage. So you could use the food processor or a knife, however you want to get your cabbage chopped small. And then normally what I do is add some salt. I'm using a Himalayan salt. You can use sea salt. You could do just a coarse salt is fine too. Kosher salt. Anything that's not iodized is ideal because too much iodine is too antibacterial. And this process, it won't work as assuredly. You know? So I'm adding some salt, and the amount is in the recipe. It's 1 tablespoon for, oh, hold on, let me double check this. 3 tablespoons of salt for 5 pounds of vegetables. Okay, I've done this enough times that my taste buds know what it should be like. So with clean hands, this is my preferred way to do it, is to mash it up. I'm gonna add some carrots in there in a minute too. Got a little piece of core here. So this is just a very, very small batch version of what people would do traditionally. And that is they would chop on the sauerkraut cutter into a really big crock. So like take this, you know, make it probably 6 gallons at least, right? And they would shred some cabbage into there, sprinkle some salt, and then somebody with their clean feet would hop in, usually a kid, would hop into the sauerkraut crock and then like stomp on the sauerkraut. It was my kind of surrogate grandfather who was also a mentor to me for sauerkraut. And he grew up in Germany in the Black Forest region. And he told me that that's what he did when he was a kid. He remembered stomping the sauerkraut with his feet. And then the kids over in France were stomping those grapes with their feet and making wine for different fermentation stuff. And it turns out that the kids in Korea are also in buckets stomping that kimchi. I taught another workshop on kimchi, and one of the women there was Korean, but she had lost the tradition in her family when they came over to Canada, how to make it. So her and I were figuring it out together. And she had this food memory that came up, which was so interesting. When the smell happened, when all of the ingredients were together, she said, I suddenly remember being about 3 and stomping kimchi in a bucket with my mom. So yeah, there's some pretty awesome food traditions like that are preserved when you're preserving food too, whether they're your food traditions or if they're newly adopted to you. So I'm continuing to chop some cabbage as I crush, and I'll show you the easier way to do this, but it takes a little bit more time. Once you have the right amount of cabbage and salt, if you don't have the strength in your hands to do the crushing, or if you just want to conserve energy, which is a good idea, pop all your cabbage in a Ziploc bag and stick it in the freezer. So I'm just omitting some air. And then I would put it flat, stick it in the freezer. And so the freezer, right, like expands the cells when the water freezes, and then when it thaws, it makes more of a watery cabbage situation. And so that's doing all the mechanical work that I'm doing right here with my hands. People are so clever, this kind of stuff. I'm gonna add a little bit of apple and carrot to mine and a bit of pickling spice, just for fun. And so when I was talking about the microbes that drive fermentation, there's some on the peels of the apple, there's some on the skin of these carrots. And so everything's just washed with water, but still has some good microbes on them. A few carrots can be grated or chopped. Just depends if you really want to see carrot in there or not. Same thing with apples. I just do slices, so I've got a few different textures. The addition of apple is interesting because this has more sugar in it, and so do the carrots, really. And so the bacteria in the cabbage and on all of the vegetables, they consume the sugars in the fruits or vegetables. And then they turn those sugars into acid. So it's kind of like making vinegar in your bowl here. So I'm gonna kind of line up my carrots and chop. And again, I would use the slicer on my food processor, which makes a nice even size too. Sometimes I put purple cabbage in here, and my product was called Rainbow Kraut, my purple sauerkraut one, because it had red cabbage or a purple cabbage, depending on who you talk to, green cabbage, carrots, and apples. So all those beautiful colors went in. A couple more cabbage here. So this is a project that my family gets together, and we do one big batch a year now that I'm only making sauerkraut for personal use these days. So we do 50 to 80 pounds of sauerkraut a year for our little family of 4. There may be more cabbage than you would eat, but I need a separate refrigerator for it, basically. Or if you have a garden shed and you live in the Pacific Northwest here, you could put it in your garden shed over the winter, and it would be just fine. About the same as a root cellar. If it doesn't get above 10 degrees or so for very long, that's a good temperature for sauerkraut. But most modern homes don't have a root cellar, and a lot of people don't have a garden shed. So when your sauerkraut is done fermenting, then you will put it in the fridge. I haven't seen any questions so far, so everyone's happy just watching me smush sauerkraut for a minute. The next step, once this is smushed sufficiently, is to stick it in the jar. Oh, forgot my pickling spice. However much you want, some sprinkles. This particular one has like allspice and cinnamon in it. It's a really nice mix. Other spices that are traditional are, I'm just going on my tippy toes so I get better leverage here. Caraway seeds. In Russia, they use caraway seeds quite often. And that's very smart as well because caraway has plant compounds in it that help dispel gas. So the gas that cabbage can produce is kind of mitigated with the caraway seeds. Cumin seeds are also used sometimes. When I teach this class live, I just put out all the spices all together, and then students can pick whatever spices they want to add to their own. And I've seen some really interesting combinations that some people are doing, like garlic and ginger with turmeric and black pepper, and doing kind of like an Indian spice one, or with mustard seeds is really nice. I've got a couple suggestions on the handout if you have it. And that's, the kimchi kraut. You can get some of the same flavors from kimchi by adding daikon radish, chili, ginger, garlic, green onions to the regular green cabbage or savoy cabbage and mash it in there. So then you kind of have a kraut process with the kimchi flavor. You can do garden kraut, which usually mine is something like garden kraut. And that means if I've got a couple of radishes ready and a couple of snap peas, but everything's not totally there, like I don't have a huge harvest of any particular thing, then I often will make a little sauerkraut. Just get one head of cabbage as the base and then add a little kale, a little snap pea, a little carrot, some thinnings of your beets, things like that. Sometimes when your harvests are really small, it's hard to know what to do aside from just eating a salad, you know? Okay, so as I'm adding and mashing, I can feel that the cabbage texture has changed. I'm gonna try squeezing it, and you can see the water come out. Another method is to just check the bottom of the bowl and see if there's a little pool. There's a little tiny one forming in the bottom, and that means it's good, it's smushed enough. I'm gonna taste a piece to know whether I put the right amount of salt in, because my taste buds remember after I've made it a number of times. But if you're new to this, just use the recipe the first few times and then you'll get the hang of it. The specific amount of salt that's in it it works out to be 2% by weight of vegetable. And that is a magic number for food safety. I'm just gonna wash my hands before I talk about the food safety thing. I think I'm just washing my hands because I talk with my hands, because I still need to get them dirty. So, the purpose of salt. I feel like I could go really long on salt. I am a nutritionist, but it may be surprising for you and not surprising for others that salt is not necessarily the bad guy. I think a crazy overabundance of refined salt, like refined iodized salt, is it's not good for anybody. But when we're talking about homemade food that just has seasoning, that if you're using a really natural salt, salt is fine for most people. Like unless you have underlying issues with hypertension already, then you shouldn't need to worry about limiting salt. If that's the case and you really do, like doctor's orders need to limit salt, still make the sauerkraut with the correct amount of salt. And then before you consume it, you can rinse it off. So some of the probiotics get rinsed off too, but I still think it's better to do it than to not do it. Because the alternative is that your sauerkraut could take a different fermentation pathway and it could go straight to the compost. And like gardeners, you guys all know about compost. So you've been fermenting this whole time, right? But compost fermentation and food preservation, they diverge. And the only difference here is that I've added enough salt to have this not turn to compost. I know there's some very crafty ways to get around it. If you add enough spices or if you add enough celery juice, which has natural sodium in it, then you can also alter that fermentation balance and have it preserved. So there are a few ways to do low sodium, but the most assured way is just stick with the salt initially, and if you need to rinse it, you can. So I'll just show you what I'm doing here. Now that my cabbage mixture is done, I just am shoving it into my jar. This is where, if you have a tool like this in the back of your wooden spoon, could be helpful. I usually just use my hands. So there's even a method where, I'm not sure if anyone at home has a vacuum sealer, like a food vacuum sealer. If you do, you can give me a little thumbs up or say hey. So this, I would call it a newfangled way of making sauerkraut. I'm not absolutely sure how I feel about it yet, because it's fermentation in plastic. You're producing acids in plastic. But some people will actually make the sauerkraut mixture in a zip seal bag. So that you wouldn't need to do any of this mashing part. You just go salt, cabbage, other ingredients, zip sealed bag, and the seal itself presses the water out of the cabbage, and you can ferment it in the bag. It causes the bag to kind of puff open. When fermentation happens, then carbon dioxide is a byproduct. So you're going to see some bubbles happening here. If you did the bag method, then you would have it puff open, and you just have to make sure it's not going to explode. People are doing some, different and nifty things with fermentation.
Right.
Now. All right. So if you're still with us, I'm pushing this down to the point where I can see liquid starting to rise. And once I have liquid all the way up at the top, then you can put your weight on. So the purpose of all this smushing and smashing is, again, to get that water out of the cabbage, to mix with the salt, creates a brine, and that brine is what protects the cabbage from going bad. So if this had a whole bunch of different air pathways in it, so if I didn't smush it down enough, then it could be prone to mold, because the whole fermentation process is going to happen at room temperature. So this is different than most food projects, very different than canning. If you've done any canning, very different than canning, because even though the end result is a pickled, preserved food that's in a mason jar, this has gone through a completely different pathway where we're actually inviting good bacteria, right? And the good bacteria can outcompete, and under the right conditions, 100% of the time they do. They outcompete the, rot producing bacteria, basically. Anything that would make molds or slimes and stuff like that. So keep smushing, and then at this point, I think I'm ready. I'm not going to fill it up any further than that little lip there. And if I was doing this in a large sauerkraut vessel, I would want to leave a pretty big gap at the top. And that's because this actually comes alive and it actually bubbles. So I want to make some space so that can happen. And so I want to make sure that the lip of the jar is nice and clean. So just take a clean rag around the top. And I'm going to fill it. The little jar, I think you guys got some shorter jars in your kits. I'm going to put a bit of weight in my jar with just some water, or you could use beans or lentils or whatever. Pop a lid on there. And then I'm going to press my jar into the bigger jar. And my aim is to have the water, it's almost there. Aim is to have the water come right up around the top and form like a moat. So those of you that did the pickling class, you're familiar with this part, keeping everything submerged and forming kind of a moat around the top. I wanted to show you a different apparatus that I have here. This is another different sauerkraut setup. So not a traditional sauerkraut crock. This is a Japanese, it's called a Pea Carrot. And I found this at a specialty Japanese store in Vancouver. I was so excited. It's a plastic container that comes with this lid, this spring-loaded like lid, and then it latches around the side. And so I knew from looking at it what this was for. The Japanese also ferment a lot of different items. And so I filled mine with the cabbage mixture, and then I pressed it down with that spring-loaded lid. And then the top just fit right on there. So this was very nice, and it kept like the smell of the sauerkraut kind of at a medium. And I had that sitting in there for about 4 weeks before I opened it up. And I wanted to show you something that happened. This is, I call it a variation of normal. So mostly, it's okay to go in there with your clean fingers. You can use a fork if you want. Your cabbage is going to be firm. So I'm just testing to see if it's great. It's firm, means it's going to be crunchy. My fingers aren't sliding around on it. It's not slimy. It smells fresh and pickly, but this one smells also a little bit yeasty. And so what happened is a couple days after I made this, it was very hot. We had a few really hot days, and that meant the fermentation from the yeast happened a little bit more, and it created a little bit more of a yeasty smell in the sauerkraut. So this isn't my like award-winning best batch ever, but this is still a very decent batch. So I'm totally fine with it. There's no food safe issue with it. It's just more of a taste thing. It's just like when you make sourdough, sometimes it's more sour and sometimes it's less sour. So it's just a matter of your taste for what you like. I'm certainly going to use this. And also I could see evidence of that yeast kind of that bloomed. There's a little bit of, there's some very, you can see little tiny white bits. That's a kind of yeast called Kahm, K-A-H-M. The Germans even have a name for it because it happens on sauerkraut, and that's fine. So a little bit of Kahm yeast happened. It floated to the top, and at that point, I just skimmed off as much of it that I could. And when the cabbage tasted sour enough, then I knew that it was ready to be put in the fridge. Just coming back to this jar here. This jar will stay on your counter for, some people say a week. Honestly, I do about a month. I like to do about a month to 6 weeks even. But the first, I don't know, evidence of fermentation or the real action that you're going to see in here will usually happen in the first 3 days or 4 days. And that's where you're going to see some bubbles perhaps happening. You're going to see the color. If you use green cabbage, you'll see the color change from bright green to olive green, just like you would with pickles if you pickled cucumbers. Or if you're using purple cabbage, you see it turn from dark purple to like a really bright fuchsia color. And so those are indications that like acid is happening. Acid is being produced in here, and the bubbles are a good indication of fermentation. Then if I had any foam that I needed to skim, I could just take the weight off, give it a good rinse, take a spoon, rinse skim the foam, put this back on. Just to make sure, it's also fruit fly season, isn't it, when the cabbages come out. So make sure we don't get any fruit flies interested. I just take a like tightly woven linen or cotton towel and put it over the top.
Yeah.
Low tech. Yeah, that's it. And then I'll leave this fairly undisturbed on the counter. And so this system, I honestly find it preferable. There are a few different systems where you could buy these things called pickle pebbles. They're like glass weights. You could put a glass weight on top of here, and then you could put an airlock on top of that. And as much as you research, you'll find all the gadgets that you think will make your life easier, of course. And I've tried them, I've been gifted them, I've bought them, and I have not found any of those to be helpful. So I don't know. If you ever see me selling some gadgets, hopefully my whole heart is behind it, because I really don't see anything more complex that's required here than a jar inside a jar. So yay, selling more mason jars. Maybe I'll work for them. That's it. And if you ever find yourself kind of running out of liquid, I guess it's possible that it could evaporate. Usually you just have to push a little bit harder and then have the liquid that's in here come to the top. If ever you really required liquid, you could take a little from a previous batch or a little bit of pickled juice and add it to here. we wouldn't really want to add more salt water because then we're taking the pH back up. We're making it more alkaline again. So we'll just try to keep it on the acidic train because that's what keeps the bad bacteria at bay. Are there any questions so far? I've got 15 minutes left or so. Curious if anyone's done any food preservation projects so far this year, whether it's drying or canning or anything. Well, I also had a recipe for something I call immunity soup. So this is like a non-traditional way of making, using up your sauerkraut. Sometimes we get excited about a project like making sauerkraut or kimchi or pickles, but then we realize they're sitting in your fridge and you're not sure how to use them. So if eating sauerkraut isn't already kind of on the menu for you, the immunity miso soup is interesting. You make a base of miso soup, and then you can put kale or chard or whatever greens, and you ladle the hot soup over top, and then you just top it with your sauerkraut, or you could use kimchi. And so it's just like a very light 5-minute lunch, and the sourness of the sauerkraut really just makes all of the flavors pop and kind of, it's basically a digestive bowl because miso itself is another fermented food that has digestive benefits. So it's a very light and like cleansing kind of soup, and maybe the opposite of something like sauerkraut with your bratwurst, but don't let that stop you having sauerkraut with your bratwurst. It's just a different idea. Any other questions, or would you guys like to, I don't know, chat gardening, fermentation, compost, anything? I know we're on Facebook Live too, but I can't see the folks over there. So if there's anything that comes up in the comments when I'm asking these questions, then maybe I could hop over there and just respond to you in text as well. Yeah. Okay, I'll give you guys an update about how my jars went, and I'm curious to know if you could take a picture or like describe the flavor of your sauerkraut when it's ready in between 1 and 6 weeks, then I would love to see that outcome.